at least as much as it is today. So we've never been far from the economics of Torah writing, in that somehow this scribe, writing in this Kabbalistic script, so just to point out, this is my studio, and that's my current version of my tikkun that I use a lot. And this happens to be a Torah from the Memorial Scrolls Trust collection that is entrusted to a synagogue in Hanover, New Hampshire. And I'm going to have a cup of coffee tomorrow and then get back to just working on this scroll. And I believe we have photos in which you can see that there are sections in which the writing is completely illegible. So anyway, my studio and a beloved German friend gave me this hanging of the alphabet. And sometimes I use a tool or a material and it brings to mind a story. And in a way, it all goes under the heading of feelings and love. So the fact that as a community, everyone here is engaging in making possible that this Torah is being restored, well then your history and your stories are part of it as well. So if we could just...
Sure, I'm sorry I can't hide the stuff at the bottom, I apologize.
Okay, so we'll just keep on going until we get to, so the cutting of the quill, and I have no idea my hands look that old. Sheila Calais is a marvelous photographer, and she's really been very, very kind to this project.
Yes.
And her photo essay grew out of something that was done in another synagogue in Sharon, Mass, in which when someone or a group was engaged in being part of the writing of a letter, it was documented by photographers in the congregation. But it's really the final cutting of the quill at just the right angle. So we'll keep on going. So this is really it. And we could, and I would love to spend another hour talking about the different tools and materials. And they're all very resonant, but one of the important ones for me, it was my karma to start this craft at the age of 40 as my eyesight was changing. And without prescription reading glasses, it would be very challenging. So I'll also point out the gold-plated scissors, so that when cutting the material, we're using something precious rather than a base metal associated with weapons of war. So if we could just go ahead to
You tell me when to stop.
Okay. So it's a beautiful scroll, and something I want to point out is that as soon as I saw it, I had a sense of its age and even its provenance. The fact that it is as big as it is and very light is actually typical of these scrolls. So a common Torah that comes from, say, the Pale of Settlement, or Russia, Poland, Ukraine, circa 1900 or 1880, is probably written on pretty heavy parchment, and it's coated on the back with a whitewash made of ground chalk to make it lighter. And it may have a beautiful writing, but it reflects that economically poor times, and not the time or the access to really high quality materials. This is beautiful material. I can't say onion skin-like, but very thin, very fine, very durable. And a scroll this size being as light as it is, I could tell by just holding it. The number of lines of a Torah, actually before we get to the close-up, and these are modern rollers. According to my late teacher, it was a Reform rabbi's invention that we should have discs that match up top and bottom, and that the handles be, he was German, Reform. One be longer than the other so that the Torah can stand upright. And they were really very uncommon before the Holocaust. So I asked, and it turned out that yes, in fact, there's an old set, and it has, I believe we found the little nail holes where the plaque that had been affixed by the trust back in 1964 are. And I was very excited to hear that some
We have the
folks...
plaque.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that
Yeah.
some folks in this congregation will restore this set, and we can reunite the Torah with the set of rollers, Atzei Chaim, trees of life, that they were on when they came from Prague. And unfortunately, that's as much as we know for sure. Extremely unlikely that it was the original set, and I don't know if it's reflected in these pictures, but when you get to the very end of the Torah, instead of just loops that tie the Torah on, you could see the imprint on the end of the scroll of crisscross. And that is an old style of sewing that went out well before 1800. So it's rare that I have the opportunity to do that. So it brings up a question of when we restore a Torah, how much of the original technique do we want to bring in? Anyway, if we go to maybe the next picture.
I'm not sure they're in the order that,
That's okay, this is it. So the next thing that I could see was that this Torah was written before 1800, and it's a function of its sewing. So I guess I could use a pointer. And it is a classic script. You know, a Sephardic script, generally speaking, the letter shin will have a flat bottom or a rounded bottom. And generally speaking, an Ashkenazi Torah will have a pointy bottom. And there are regions like southeastern Europe where they seem to be blended together. And really, if you think about the whole Austria-Hungary Empire region, it was sort of a confluence of cultures. In fact, as they say, you know, the gates of Vienna, you know, almost was conquered by the Arab world. And what we have here is essentially a Sephardic style of writing, and I would love to sit down with small groups and get our pens and show it, but written with a quill and written not on the shiny leather, but on the suede. And it means that there's hint. I really can't say much more right now, but so there's a style of sewing that we call blind stitching. That means the Torah is post 1800, and this is an earlier version. And I'm not sure if it's this one. Okay. We also let's go to one that has the entire scroll again. Just keep on going.
not sure.
Okay. So I was looking at the scroll, and there are Kabbalistic elements in this Torah, as there are in many of the Torahs that come to the Memorial Scrolls Trust collection. I promised to kind of wind down with my comments at 8:30 so we can open it up. They include certain letters that might be large and small that aren't required, or embellished letters, or indentations, or breaks in the text, or an odd number of lines. And as I was rolling through, somehow I noticed that there was part of the Torah that's 49 lines and part that's 50, which is very unusual. So many of the scribes in that region at that time were sort of pushing the envelope of what's acceptable practice, but always staying within the bounds of the halacha, that is the laws that say what constitutes a kosher Torah. So what we have here on the word alav is interesting because in any other Torah, you would just have dots. Okay, this is actually part of our transmission of these words, that there's some letters, the words that have dots over them. Sometimes it seems very clear why, and sometimes we just have to say, as Tevye did, this is part of the tradition. But this scribe made those dots into something quite elegant, almost like the S-holes on a violin. And with many of the memorial scrolls, the closer you look, the more you see that the scribe chose to do a little embellishment on, say, one letter shin and not the other. So, we have many, you can just go to the next one, many traditions of interpretation, but there it is, that every human being who writes a Torah it's reflecting their unique experience of writing Torah. So, in that way, whereas every single Torah should have the same text, and to be fair, there are about a single handful of variations between Ashkenazi and Sephardi. The changing of a letter that doesn't change meaning, and in a way that the rabbi's been able to justify. And yet, when a letter is written in a slightly different way, what is the scribe telling us? So what was that scribe telling us by making those little dots have little wispy extra things on them? So, okay, we can keep on going.
Yep.
So,
Keep going.
okay, so here is just an example of, whereas much of the work will be structural, there are places where the ink is either faded or it is chipped away, and that's acceptable as long as it's still legible. When in doubt, grab your local 12, almost 13-year-old who should know their Hebrew letters but is not yet responsible as an adult. My advertisement that everyone who gets to the age of bar mitzvah should become a voting member of their synagogue. Good say there. Were to look at that letter and see some missing ink, might it be unclear? And if it might be unclear, those are the letters that we want to repair. So this is two cases of patching. In the first one, up above, it was when the parchment was first prepared, and you can imagine, maybe it was near the shoulder, and it was a little bit thin, and as the parchment was stretched, it got very thin, and then was patched, and then the text was laid out around it. That's kosher. If the whole breaks into the integrity of a letter of a word, that needs to be dealt with. And what happened here was that there was a tear, and although it is a method of patching that we don't do anymore, what we do today is we patch on the back. As I said, we use another piece of parchment. And in my studio, I have a hot glue pot. I boil down scraps of parchment and those things that otherwise would be buried, and it gets past the Jell-O stage. You can't use kosher Jell-O, and it makes a hot glue. But for whatever reason, there was a time long ago in which it was repaired by being sewn. Now, it doesn't make it not kosher, but let's say not cricket. If this were coming apart, I would take it apart and then patch it. But there's a leniency with repair that says, if this is the way it was done, and it was accepted as kosher, and bearing in mind the responsibility of the trust to preserve these scrolls, let's lean on the side of not changing unless we have to. I'm grateful that whoever did it stopped the tear. Because if the tear had continued either between the letters or broken up a letter, the kosher way of repairing it is to scrape away the word and rewrite it on either side. That might mean that we need to rewrite a number of words so that we don't have great big gaps. But what we can't do is do that with the name of God. Because to scrape away ink of the name of God would be violating raising up in holiness. So throughout the Torah, there are very interesting cases about the sewing and about the patching. But if you continue, what I may do here is still do a patch on the back as well. But then there's the issue of creasing. And you'll see it in a moment. So because this material is so fine and it's dried out some, when the Torah was not rolled snugly, there might have been binding and creasing. And if that creasing manages to either break up the ink from a letter or just to maybe a letter, I believe the word is occluded. It's hidden because it's hiding behind. That is one of the ways that the Torah is not kosher, because at this moment, one of the 304,805 letters is not legible. And even though many of us grown-ups know very well that that's an aleph, maybe someone would look at it and say, I don't recognize it. Maybe it's a tzadi. So those are the places where it needs to be patched. And that would entail, and we don't try this at home, but very carefully dampening the parchment, pressing it, letting it dry flat, and then, because parchment, remember, the skin is stretched and sanded and scraped, it can't wait to stretch back into its animal form. There'd be a patch on the back that keeps it from folding again. This is just a wonderful example of a place where a letter is written large, and we have a tradition of why it's written large, because it says that do not bow down to El Acher, to an El, to a God that is other. And remember in the Shema, we have the large Dalet, where it's talking about God as one. So let's be clear that we don't want to say don't bow down to the one God, but to God that's other. So there are some cases where these scribal variations are midrash, or interpretation. So I think there's one more I wanted to show, and then, yes. So just to remember that the Torah is 5 books, and they are written in such a way that they can't actually be divided easily into separate books, and is really unique in an Ashkenazi practice. We have columns of text, and the books are separated by 4 lines. But you can see where the lines were pressed in, and our letters are hanging down. I think that might be it. There might be one more. Okay, so this is one of the exceptions of where we have a line break, and there's 2 places in the scroll in which the song that we sing celebrating the miracle of survival because we got through the Red Sea, Micha Mocha is in it, is to be written as brickwork. And then at the very end, Moses' farewell, we have just 2 half columns in which the columns are double and skinny. But as we look at our scroll, we'll pay attention to these open spaces, because this might be one of the places where the scribe would embellish letters, because there's room in which he can do it. So I want to close, I don't think there's more.
I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah. This is just at the very end of the scroll, tear out, and I was almost relieved that there was this situation, because it really makes it easier to say, wouldn't you really rather restore it and take it off this and put it on the original rollers? So, but that's Moses' farewell. So in a traditional siyum, or completion ceremony, when the Torah is written, these letters are not written by the scribe. They might be outlined, but they're to be written by members of the congregation that commissioned it, and customarily it's the rabbi who had the honor, or has the honor, of writing the very last letter. And at that moment, that rabbi is also in a position to say, now it's a kosher Torah. So in our case, there will be sections throughout the scroll in which the last letters will not be written, so that the mitzvah credit can be for this community. But once upon a time, it really was written, instead of the scribe writing the letter on your behalf, it really was written by people who were honored. And that's why, as you look through other scrolls, notice that the last letters and the first letters of the Torah usually are not written in the best handwriting. So I would like to segue to our conversation with some reflections on moving forward. The state of the scribal world is such that we no longer have local scribes unless we live in a few very particular places. And whereas once upon a time we were all scribes. Let's imagine that we had the the leisure in our lives that we can take a year, and everyone else is doing it too. So we're, instead of we're all playing golf, we're all writing Torah. But until not long ago, a small city had a scribe, a lot of large towns had scribes, even in this country. And we're living in a world in which there are fewer and fewer. But once upon a time, if you were a liberal congregation or a totally secular congregation, you still could go down the street in a major metropolitan area, and there was the scribe. And the distance has become greater. First of all, that scribes are in New York, they're in Israel, they're not in too many other places. But the gap, the space between our communities has widened. And we have a sustainability challenge, and that is that although we all rely on Torah, we love Torah, Torah keeps on informing what we're about, as the generations go by, and that Torah is not written and repaired and maintained within communities across the spectrum, it would only take a decision by a well-placed rabbinic authority in Israel to say, okay, no more of selling Torahs to egalitarian congregations. There are divisions in the Jewish world. We've been having divisions ever since we went through the 40 years in the desert, kicking and screaming and revolting. And yet there are challenges in this day and age that really threaten an irreparable split. So one of the challenges of that is, you happen to live in an area, Hartford, where there are scribes, and you even have another scribe who's up the road, in just western Massachusetts. But there ought to be the capability of writing Torah, just as we rely or have relied on foreign sources of energy, and we've done wonderful things with that, with as oil, and yet the more that we become reliant on ourselves, we have the capacity to keep on going, even if something like what happened in the early 70s were to happen. So a benefit of having the capacity, the knowledge, the physical ability, muscle memory even, to write Torah, is that we can perpetuate Torah, which is what we've done, 613a. The other is that with all of the divisions in the Jewish world, we will disagree on what it means to do Jewish, of who here is or isn't Jewish, and yet, across the board, from the most traditional separate community to the most, what's the word? Inclusive. If we look at each other and we say, yeah, but we're all caring enough about Torah that we will invest our love and our expertise and our resources in order to perpetuate Torah, it just may be the future. So I want to look a little bit past the present. We're in a state of crisis. It wasn't that long ago that we were so devastated that the restoration of this Torah is integrally linked with memory, and memory of a particular time and place. But there will come a time in which we only tell the story of people who lost relatives. And we won't forget, and yet that memory of what happened in those terrible times will not be enough to perpetuate Torah. And this is where the fact that Torah links back, that this Torah is a direct descendant, because they really were copied from early Torahs, to the original Torah, however you conceive of it being transmitted. So I encourage you to write Torah. And if you can't write an entire Torah, to write a single letter. And let's bring into all communities the ability to be sacred publishers with God. But we come to the question about the restoration of these Torahs. And I have to say, it's of vital interest to me as a scribe who is working on a proposal for a doctoral project, which is how are these Torahs held and kept and thought of? And what might be guidance in the future? The story, the provenance, is so powerful that sometimes a congregation will say, yes, we understand that there are these guidelines about what's a kosher Torah or not, but the story of this Torah is so exceptional that we will consider it kosher even if it's not complete. I don't have a response to that, except to suggest that we elevate the Torah even higher by treating it as a living Torah. That, as special as it is, it's raising it to the honor of being an ordinary Torah, like all the others that are directly descended from Sinai. It'll get down to nitty-gritty questions about when we restore this Torah, should we use black ink, or should we use ink that's colored to match? When the Holocaust happened, this Torah was only about 200 years old, late Middle Age. Now it's 275. It could be used for another 100 years if it's treated well. Is there a point at which we say enough that no matter how old it is, we don't restore it just because it has this incredible memory? Is there a point at which we treat it like any other damaged ancient Torah, and like a person, we lovingly give it a burial? I think that it's almost inconceivable in this day and age that we would do that with this Torah. And yet, when we think about, the most precious thing to us, besides each other, is the Torah scroll. But when we think about the preciousness of a human life, and there comes a time in which to no longer do heroic measures, is it actually honoring the Torah more at some point to not restore it? In this case, it's clear, and what a wonderful, joyous celebration that the Torah, which is still usable. If you think about the hands that have touched this Torah, they're all connected. From the ones who wrote it and repaired it, and the ones who, gave the shekels to fund it 250 years ago, and the ones who read from it, and all the ones today, and really connected with the ones that are unimaginable in the future, is the obligation in this case to preserve a Torah as usable, as readable in a service, unlike any other, or at what point will we let it go? I am not interested in giving an answer, but I'm beginning to raise questions that I hope the trust, who is responsible, might eventually have guidelines about, well, here's the point at which you wouldn't restore. I want to close this part with a comment about the other scroll and a little teaching from my late teacher. So about scroll number 1412, it was a stunning moment to roll through this beautiful Torah, probably older, written in an exquisite script inspired by the Spanish, Portuguese, medieval writing, and thinking this would be amazing to read. And we got to the very end, and for lack of a better word, we were confronted with a cloud of black mold. I don't know if it really was, but the last, 3 or 4 panels were disintegrating. It isn't clear why. I don't actually believe it was anything this congregation did. It could be that when they were stored away in the 40s, there was dampness, and when they came here to this country decades ago, it was already like that. But it isn't necessarily true that it could not ever be repaired, because what could be done is that section removed and set aside, and we have an obligation to care for the remnants of these Torahs, and you could rewrite it yourselves, with the permission of the trust. That there is actually the potential, but because the Torah is grounded, it has always been about real people and real economics and real materials, you have to say, is this where we would devote our resources? Better it may stay where it is and tell its story in its own way. So we will have a little discussion, but I wanted to, fortunately, the thing that I wanted to show you is sitting at the bottom of my knapsack. So I'm going to go to this page in my teacher's book. in which he talks about the recipe for ink. And so you have to understand that Eric Ray was like a Pied Piper, and he was very playful. And when there was an extra thing to be strict about, if it gave holiness, he'd say, let's be stricter. And he loved that there was a time that he would go to get his ink from this very modest rabbi who didn't want to be photographed for the book. So, but he served his ink in baby bottles, and it was, and I inherited that baby bottle. And so he said, think about, what goes into feeding a baby. And I don't have one to show, but do you know what a gallnut is, an oak gall? So sometimes you see on an oak leaf a little ball that looks like a little golf ball. And, the colonial era ink was made in a similar way, but they tended to use either oak galls or acorns, because there's an acid, tannic acid, that there's a chemist here who's going to say that I got it wrong. But basically, as it oxidizes, it blackens, and possibly connected with the dark outlines of oak leaves that you might see in a sidewalk. So that is the active ingredient of Torah ink. And if you look at one of these, I'm going to see if it's actually, there's a picture of it. Oh, it might be in the photograph. What you'll see is that there's a little hole, and it's because of how this came about. So, what they are were places in which wasps got to grow. And you have to picture this little globe with a tiny hole in it. And here's the story that my teacher would tell, a foot taller with a British accent. A mother wasp full of wasp eggs stings an oak leaf. And just as if you got stung, you might make a blister, the oak leaf makes a blister. And into that space, the wasp leaves the eggs. And a delicious green filament-like material grows from the tree and nourishes the wasps. And when they're ready, they chew a little hole and make their way out into the world. And then, if you live in New England especially, and you're walking through the woods in the autumn, you look down and you see these, you grind them up, you let them steep like a tea for a year, or you speed up that blackening process with copper sulfate, and you add some gum arabic, the sap of the acacia tree, and a little bit of soot to make it dark, and then you have your Torah ink. And he'd say, you see how the love of a mother looking for a home for her babies goes into every drop of ink. And that is really, and has been, and should be in the future, how we engage with Torah, whether it be 613A or B. Obviously, I could go on, but I'd like to invite questions. Comments about this Torah, about the enterprise of writing Torah, about the scribal state of the world today, and in particular, if there's questions about what's happening on this community level that Paul and Ruth might want to field as well. And I will try to be brief in my responses.
I know they're rare, or rarer, but is the scribing of a Haftarah scroll any different?
Yes, very much, because the Haftarah scroll is selections of the books, mostly of prophets, and there are some communities still in which the whole rest of the Torah is still written by hand, which you can do, but in terms of Jewish law, there's not a need to. So it's more or less a modern phenomenon promoted by the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, which I really love, to commission scrolls that are written with the same tools and technology, but are written really as a tool for reading. So they'll have what I lovingly call the training wheels of the Haftarah trope, and the vowels, and a label that says what each reading is. And I was actually asked to write one, and when I really looked at what it would take to write it and to check it, because you can't scan columns and send them to Machon Ot and have them send you printout to say you might want to check out some areas for accuracy. It actually was prohibitively expensive. So like most scribal things, they're written by very modestly paid scribes in Israel. It's actually, I consider it a more or less new way of engaging with the text, which is to choose to use an old technology even though we don't need to. We do need to use the old technology for Torah. And had I another hour, I would talk about my adventures in cutting 78 RPM records, even though we don't need that anymore. Again, like the fact that women are writing Torahs, it's part of it. So I will try to, yes.
How does our 250-year-old Torah compare to others that you've restored?
I would say that it is in actually very good condition, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't need a lot of work. But the fact that we're talking about all told a couple of months, if I were doing nothing else, a couple of months of work is comparable to what a modern Torah goes through. In the series from Sheila Pillay, and I believe it'll be on display at some point, you will see another scroll in which column after column needs to be reconstructed, and there are some in which they really are completely illegible. So I would say that your Torah has been having a very active life, and like someone who's in his late 50s, there's some minor attention that must be given to one's health to keep on going. But I would say that it is in, the best 20% of scrolls that I've seen.
And age-wise, how does it compare to others that?
Age-wise, it really is typical. So it's they are pre-1800 and written on fine parchment, and many of them in this style.
Thank you.
What about the mold for the other Torah? Is there any way to keep it from progressing? Or-
I actually have to say, I don't know. I came home from that thrilling day. I was immersed in how do you mitigate mold, and then went on this trip of memory in Europe, and I didn't get back to it. But it would be important to just, actually for the safety, to just make sure that this is not an active mold. But I
Actually, to
don't
your
know.
point, the two of the things that we plan on doing is, one is putting sort of climate control in the
Yeah.
ark to preserve all the Torahs. And along with that, figure out a way to clean the mold, get the mold to stop
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
And then preserve it in
Because
some time.
it dark, it's warm, because
Exactly.
especially if it's in the inside part.
Exactly.
It's not going to be that,
Yeah.
much help with.
And I would say that when a Torah is restored or even fundamentally altered, that's a decision that's made with the approval, but really engagement with the Memorial Scrolls Trust. And I can imagine a number of different approaches, including,
Just cutting it out.
Letting it go.
Well, we'll see.
yeah.
I am,
Wait,
Maybe one-
and one
one more question.
How will an Orthodox congregation accept this Torah that we as women will help scribe?
Well, there are different ways of approaching it. One
Now, my
is-
grandfather would
one-
not let me read
yeah.
from the Torah.
Right. So, we have a tradition that says, this will be yeah. And
Real
then-
fast.
and then
I'm like
over
the
my-
taskmaster.
Over my second cup of tea, please. Remember, what makes a Torah kosher, right? Not its story, or what it went through, or how beautiful it is. It's are those letters there, nothing more and nothing less. So a Torah is not signed on the back. And there's a sense in which the Torah is a product of its writers until it is complete and accepted as a kosher Torah. And then it's really like a human being who stands on its own. That's why there's going to be an element in our Simchat Torah celebration, which is like celebrating at a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a newborn. So there is a tradition that says we actually don't need to question, what do we know about that scribe who wrote the Torah 250 years ago? So we have a tradition that says that if it's a Torah, it is presumed to be a kosher Torah. And I think that there's somewhat of a reluctance across the board to declare a Torah not kosher on the basis of its interaction. Also, Torahs, if you were to go by an idea that says, will some people make a Torah not kosher by their nearness? We have a clear rabbinic decision that Torah is not made not kosher by any interaction. Including, God forbid, it was held by the Nazis in the museum that they didn't really want to make, and then it comes to us. So there is a presumption of holiness of a Torah scroll. I don't know. I think that it would seem on the face of it that a more traditional, a synagogue from a more traditional world would avoid a Torah that came from a Reformed synagogue in this day and age, but only, I think, on the level of this is case by case and not as a general rule. And I think the general rule has yet to be made because the situation is still, what do they say, like a crime scene? That's a bad word.
Active.
Right. This new world is still kind of evolving, and the normal way is that we take generations to think these things through. So what is clear is that we are in a world in which women are engaging in Torah in a way that was only associated with men until a few generations ago. How exciting.
I want to thank Rabbi Hale for being here. I know all of us, I'm hoping he will come back again.
For the other half of my notes that I did.
Points. One, Rabbi Becca really wanted me to express to all of you, she planned her vacation this week. We were supposed to have this 2 weeks ago, so she's so really sad that she isn't here. But thanks to Michael, she'll be able to hear the talk and certainly be part of the conversation next time. The other is outside there are sheets for scribing. If you are interested in scribing, most of the people who are here have already made your commitment to scribe. But if you haven't, you can do it there, you can do it online. I've said this innumerable times. It's more important that all of us participate in scribing. It would be nice for those who can afford to help us. We thank you, but really it's more important as a community for us to be involved in scribing. So I want you all to be there. So do what you can, encourage your friends to be there. And I thank everyone for being here, and to Rabbi Hale, I thank you so much for everything.